Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining me on another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. I'm really excited for this one. As I've said on social media, I've got kind of a real good connection to this topic. It's got a place close to my heart because I have a family connection. And that's actually I came to know Patrick pretty well because we both have an interest in this topic. So I'm really excited to get this one going. Hey, good evening. Thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Brett. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's really, like I just said, it's a really interesting topic. As you know, I have the family connection. Been talking about a little bit about that on Twitter a little lately, and I posted a picture of my great-grandfather, I think the other week or two, and people are really interested in that. So I think it's an undervalued, I'd say, underappreciated topic. So your book on it is literally groundbreaking because there's almost nothing on that. So for those of you who don't know or maybe just tuned in, Patrick's book is on conscripts, Canadian conscripts in the First World War. So not about the political parts of it. I mean, there's been lots of that done on that, all the political infighting, the Union government, all that stuff. This book looks at the conscripts themselves. So it's a really great one. Again, it's like the only one out there. So I just wonder if you can kind of tell people who might not know how you came to this subject.
Sure. Well, I guess first thing I should say, thank you for having me again on your program, and hello to all your listeners. Thanks to you as well for joining us on this day, this particular day, 103 years ago today. A cousin of mine, Private Theobald Kaza, was killed in action with the 47th Battalion as he crossed the Canal du Nord. So it is an on this day event that I share with you. But my interest in the subject of conscription goes back quite a ways. I first thought about it when I was attending university, and at the University of Windsor, across from Detroit, we had quite a few students who were attending what they call college on the GI Bill. They were veterans, U.S. Army veterans who had been drafted, completed their tour of service, and were going through college. We also, by the way, had quite a few draft dodgers on campus as well. So there was a mix among the Americans of both draft dodgers and draftees. But I really didn't give much thought about the subject for quite some time. As a matter of fact, it was 20 years later when I was serving in Ottawa that I decided to find out about my grandfather's military service. And I went out to Tunney's pasture, and this is before the internet. I actually filled out the application at the personal records depository, handed it to the guy, and he said, "Just wait there." And 30 minutes later, he handed me back 13 pages of about my grandfather's service. So it was instant delivery. But that's when I found out for the first time that my grandfather had been conscripted. So that gave me some food for thought, and I asked my father questions about that, but I really didn't take up the subject again for quite some time. After that, I served in Europe for 10 straight years, and in NATO, of course, all the countries, or all the NATO countries, were still practicing conscription at the time. There's only 6 now that do it. 10 countries have, other countries have it on their legislative bookshelves for immediate implementation.
Right.
But at the time, they all had it. So there were draftees everywhere. And subsequent to that, I ended up being posted to Israel as a defense attaché. And of course, conscription there was the norm. So I met quite a few conscripts, men and women alike. But I never really took up the subject of conscription in my grandfather's service until 2008, when I attended a 90th anniversary lecture about Canada and the 100 Days campaign, the 90th anniversary of that. And it was a very distinguished speaker who gave a superb presentation, after which I asked a question. I said to the speaker, "What role do you think the Canadian conscripts played in the 100 Days campaign?" Right. And he paused for just a moment, and he said, based on his research, it was his view that Canadian conscripts had arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to make any significant difference whatsoever to the 100 Days campaign or the victories there. Right. That I was quite surprised by. So I had another question, but I waited until after the lecture was over. And I asked him privately. First of all, I told him that my grandfather had served with the 18th Battalion in France, and that he had arrived at Amiens on the 13th of August, 1918. He looked at me. He was quite surprised. He said, "Can you prove that?" Which of course I could. I said to him very quickly, I said, do you think that 24,000 conscripts, which was the number that the official historian had documented, was not a significant number? And he quite bluntly said, no, right away. No, it's not. Because if you took that number measured against over 600,000 attestations, it was not significant in his view. It was only later that I discovered that there were only 236,000 of that 600,000 plus that actually served in France, enlisted. So the numbers start changing, and of course, it was something else I wanted to look at. So, but he gave me some food for thought, and I decided to look into this a little bit more deeply. And I wrote an article that was published in the Journal of Canadian Military History about a year later. I
got a copy behind me somewhere. Yeah. It's on the shelf.
It's documented. It is here.
Yeah, that's it.
It was very well received, documented my grandfather's service. But in the course of my research, I discovered quite a few myths and quite a few unanswered questions. And so I posited these myths. And one of the people that read it with great interest was Tim Cook at the Canadian War Museum. Mm-hmm. And afterwards, he congratulated me on my effort and said that in his view, I had turned a new page in Canadian military history. I said, well, thank you, Tim. That's very kind of you to say that. He said, well, the bad news is now you have to write a book. I didn't know what he meant by that, but now I do.
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
It was 8 years later that Reluctant Warriors was published. So it took 8 years to do the research. Fortunately, at the time, I think I mentioned this to you before, the ability to access records was still quite limited. So I had to purchase a lot of the records until they started coming online. Right. Although the attestation papers themselves were all online at the time. So that was a big help. So I combined all that information in, war diaries and a lot of other things. And yeah, but it took 7 years, and then the editing and publishing process, and here we are. So that's the background for the subject.
Yeah, and well, I actually have two copies because I got a review copy, but here's the book. There's links in the description below for those of you who want to buy it. Again, I say this all the time, but I get a little commission from it, but it does help me keep doing this stuff. So if you can buy it and you're interested in it, please do through there. If you can, for whatever reason, get the book anyway. It's worth reading. Again, I said I have a personal interest in the subject, but it is a good book. The work that Patrick has done is impressive and is groundbreaking. I mean that almost literally, because we were just talking before. There's nothing like this. Now, there's books like about the political stuff, like by J.L. Granstein wrote on this a long time ago, and has even updated the book 2 or 3 times now about conscription in Canada, generally speaking. But this one is the Conscripts book. And again, I was going through this morning. It's my old notes that I had on the book from when I did some writing on it and my own work. The thing that stuck out to me again, and this I think is an important point, is you mentioned that most Canadian men of military age at the time did not enlist, did not join the CEF. You call them the silent majority, because in many ways they were silent, right. Especially as the war goes on. Because you talk about in how 1914 there's the rush to the colors that most people know about and all that stuff. And then, but you say, and you take quotes from people at the time saying that doesn't last. And I was just wondering if you could talk about what that means and kind of the language you use at the beginning of your book.
The lead up to conscription, I think, is what you're referring to, the call to the colors.
Well, even before that. So like because you mentioned early in the book, right, there's the rush to colors, and then that sort of draws down. Right. And then there's this pressure within society. It's not official. It's not real. All these men up until late 1917 are still volunteers. Yeah. You posit that as a problematic term because of all the different things that means.
As I mentioned in my book, one judge out in Winnipeg, Manitoba, said there were no volunteers after 1914. I mean, you can take that for what it's worth, but What happened, of course, is after the Canadian division went overseas and was blooded at Second Ypres. I mean, 2,000 dead, 6,000 casualties, an enormous number when you consider the men in battle on those a few days. And that's when, the casualty list started coming in and the reality started to set in. And of course, by that time, Canada was forming a second division, which arrived in September, I believe, the second division, or August, and then the third division in December of 1915, but the fourth division didn't arrive till the following August. But so now you're building up one division after another, but you're starting to experience casualties. So you need replacements. Well, there were still sufficient volunteers, people that were willing to join up voluntarily throughout 1915. But around about April 1916, they noticed a significant decline in numbers because by that time, the reality of this whole endeavor was setting in, and so it wasn't going to be. It didn't end in Christmas 1914. It didn't end in Christmas 1915, and there they were in 1916, and things were starting to look very dark. In January 1916, of course, the British, who had never dreamed of having conscription, implemented it in England,
right?
And of course, all the European countries had conscription, so this wasn't new for them. But the British needed more soldiers for the British Army, and it soon became apparent that the Canadians were going to need more soldiers as well. That really didn't become apparent to Prime Minister Borden until Vimy, over 10,000 casualties. He was overseas at the time and met with some of the people in the hospital, the wounded. And it became clear to him. I mean, there have been cries for conscription before that. Not soldiers, but people that had not enlisted in 1916, or late 1915, 1916. This is when the White Feather campaign came out, where people who were not serving, a white feather could get pinned on your lapel, indicating that you were some sort of coward or something. But
I did want to talk about that real quick because that is true, right? That's a fairly well-known part of Britain's war, Canada's war. But I think it's even you mentioned in your book, I can't remember where I read it somewhere, that yes, they would pin these feathers on them, but in some cases it was physical violence.
There was they attacked
them. Yeah, they attacked them in the street and literally stabbed them with the feather. It's just, to me, it's just mind-boggling.
There was, and there was all kinds of other things that happened. But it's interesting when you think later on in my research, when I discovered that it was only a third of the draft age men, 20 to 45 or 18 to 45, I should say. The draft, of course, when it was implemented, was for 20-year-olds to 45, but the military age, 18 to 45, only a third of Canadian men actually served during the war. So by 1916, these things were happening. There was a civilian recruiting league established. There was the churches were calling for young men to join up. Newspapers, almost universally, with the exception of some, obviously in Quebec, were unanimous in their support. So there was quite a bit of pressure on young men to join up, notwithstanding the fact that there was, other pressures for these young men to stay home. I mean, we found out when conscription was eventually implemented that there were certain services that were deemed essential. Farmers, for example, were deemed essential. Munition workers were deemed essentials. Railway workers were deemed essential. And quite frankly, each individual family had its own situation where, there might have been only one person providing for the family, and it was this young lad. So there were lots of reasons for not joining up. But the reality was that the casualty lists were growing longer. And the reality was that people that did sign up had a bloody good chance of being killed or wounded. Mm-hmm. So that had to factor into a lot of people's decision making, and did, not only for the people who ended up volunteering, but eventually for the conscripts.
So, right. And sorry, just to go back here, because we have I got the wrong one here. Sorry, give me 1 second. So this is a good question from Norma. Hey, Norma, thanks for watching. So I'm not too sure, to be honest. I mean, the actual white feathers, I know, especially from reading your book and my own research, the things like the pressure in the cities, the social pressure within the churches and everything is fairly well documented, especially now more of these stories are coming out. But I'm not too sure if, to me, it sounded like it was mostly an urban thing with the actual white feathers and all of that. But I don't know if you came across anything.
No, I think you're right. The only evidence I came across of it was happening in urban areas. But
Yeah.
that does raise an interesting point about the whole support for conscription. Coming back to what I was saying, when Borden came back after Vimy, that's when he announced in Parliament in May that they were going to table legislation. It was tabled in June, second reading in July the 6th, 1917, and then royal approval on the 29th of August. But by that time, he had prorogued his government and intended to create a unionist cabinet and put it to the Canadian people with an election scheduled for the 17th. So even though conscription was approved in England, when conscription was approved in January, it was within a few weeks after royal assent that the first soldiers were being conscripted.
Right.
In Canada, it was approved on the 29th of August, a royal assent. But the first class of conscripts, there were 6 classes. The first class was those young men aged 20 to 34, single or widowed with no children, were not called up until the 13th of October, 1917. And they had a month to present themselves, to register and do a physical. Otherwise, they were considered in the military and subject to military law if they were found.
Yep.
They were considered defaulters.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because as you talked about before, and as many people know, all these records are available online. They're all digitized now. I mean, a couple of years ago, they were getting towards the end, because I remember when I was doing my own conscription work, I was looking at the area where I'm from and where my great grandfather had served. And like one of the soldiers, unfortunately, had a Y last name, or it was a W, so it wasn't digitized yet. But I also couldn't get the physical file. So anyway, so that was quite annoying, because I was like, "We're going to digitize it, but we haven't yet. But you can't look at it." So anyway, but that was it's interesting because you can see all the different things, and you mentioned it talking about the process. I mean, there's the 1917 election, which I don't want to talk about too much, but it's an important part of this because it's contested on conscription, right?
Yes.
Borden is prime minister. He convinces, because somebody asked her about what the unionist government was. He got a good chunk of liberals to jump ship, join what was then the Conservatives, and form a unionist government, and then they declare an election. Yeah. Now there's all kinds of very undemocratic things, quite a few democratic things. I mean, women with family members were given the vote. New immigrants had the vote taken away. I mean, it's quite an interesting time period. But again, I don't want to talk about that too much.
No, but it is an essential point. In my book, I cover as much as necessary for the reader to understand the basics of the political debate that you just mentioned. Yeah. But for the benefit of your listeners, obviously you mentioned Dr. Granstein had written about this subject back in 1977 initially, and he's written on it much more in the last 10 years about the politics of conscription. Yes. And there's a great article, a great paper that was done by Serge Derflinger that was published in Turning Point, published in 1917, explaining the impact of Vimy and what it had on the whole conscription process. But as far as the politics, this being the most corrupt election in Canadian political history, it's hard. You mentioned some of the reasons for that, but there's a book that was also published in 2017 that I can highly recommend by Professor Patrice Dutil and David Mackenzie of Ryerson University. That book is called Embattled Nation, Canada's Wartime Election of 1917. And that I can highly recommend if anybody really wants to get into an in-depth understanding of what happened
behind me too.
in that election. But that's a great book. But yes, the politics of conscription is not obviously the focus of my book, but it certainly is mentioned, I think, in sufficient detail in the book.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, that's not your objective, as we just talked about, was not that, but it's important to understand. I mean, there's so much going on here, and we were talking about, again, at the local level, and that has impacts because of the election. Yeah. I mean, I read all kinds of different things that, even within families, there was differences and all this stuff. So it obviously has an impact. I mean, politics always has an impact, but this election is so, like you said, it's the most corrupt election in Canadian history by a long shot. Like, it's not even close. Like, the things I've read and did some research on this, and even came up in doing my PhD when I wasn't actually doing anything on it. It's so pervasive. It's unavoidable when you're talking about this.
There's some interesting things that happened with the election, though, that are worth mentioning. It, I think, and that is, it was obviously in Quebec. There was not much support for. I mean, Laurier, won most of his seats in Quebec.
Yeah,
but the rest of the country generally voted in favor of conscription.
Right.
If you look at what the rest of the country thought about conscription, generally speaking, apart from the results of this election, was conscription was opposed coast to coast across Canada. I mean, in the Maritimes, in British Columbia, in the Midwest, in Ontario, generally speaking, people were opposed to conscription. And so we shouldn't be surprised when we look at the exemptions, because when conscription was implemented, I mentioned on the 13th of October, the first class was called. They could get an exemption, and about 94% of the country requested an exemption and received it for those that fell into official categories. And the lowest was, I think, British Columbia, which was something like 89%.
Yeah, something like that.
But I think Saskatchewan was higher, a bit higher than even any of the other provinces, with the exception of Quebec. But generally speaking, the opposition to conscription wasn't, a Quebec thing, a Francophone thing. It was a Canada-wide thing. So it was a bit of a surprise in some respects that when the vote came, because it really was on the subject of conscription, a plebiscite, for lack of a better word, on conscription, and Canadians voted in favor, as they did. The military vote overseas was overwhelmingly in favor, although there are some people who did not support it, who I document in my book, did not want their younger brothers to come over,
right,
and do what they had been through.
Which I think is
interestingly enough. My grandfather, when the Second World War came along, and conscription was seriously being considered then, he told my father, "You don't want to get conscripted because they're going to send you into the military." Conscripts, when they were conscripted, 97% of them went into the infantry, which of course had the highest casualty rate. So my father did not get conscripted. He joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and went to fly bombers, where there was a higher casualty rate than there was in the trenches of the First World War. So he was lucky he survived. That's why I'm here. But I think him and his father had an interesting discussion about that when he got back from overseas.
Oh, I bet. What do you mean? Sorry, just to bring my own story into this, because I wanted to talk about the process in a second. But my own great-grandfather was a farmer, Southern Ontario. Like you said, this isn't a Quebec thing. He put in for an exemption when I was first, because he was in the first group, like you mentioned, the age group, and no children. He wasn't married yet, no children. He was the only adult male left on the farm, other than his father, my great-great-great grandfather. Right. So they needed to keep running the farm. Like I found that within of all things, this is interesting, because I wanted to mention this too, but I only found it because of a newspaper. Like, they literally published these proceedings.
Names. That's right.
Because, as in one of the things, and I have other opinions about, the Supreme Court Justice Lyman Duff, he's connected to Hong Kong, but also he ordered the conscription, and I'll ask you about this in a second, but the conscription, the tribunals and all this, to ask for these exemptions destroyed. He said, because they're so hate-filled or something like that.
Right.
So I was wondering if you could kind of give a quick understand, or just a quick, how the process went, right? Say you're in that group, now what? Like, what do I have to do? Say it's me, I'm in that first group. What do I have to do?
Well, there was a form to fill out requesting an exemption, and a local tribunal a three-person tribunal, one government person, two local people sat in on the tribunal, and they decided yay or nay. In most cases, just judging by the percentages I mentioned a few moments ago, they were accepted. If they weren't accepted, there was then a regional level tribunal that adjudicated on the matter, and if that failed, there was the one final sort of supreme judge, Lyman Duff, to determine whether or not you got an exemption. But urban people typically were not exempt. My grandfather, for example, who was a streetcar conductor, that was not an essential trade by any shape or imagination. But farmers were. The exemption, you mentioned the exemption results that have been destroyed. Interestingly enough, there are some that weren't destroyed. And I mentioned one set in my books from Montreal,
right,
that give us a glimpse at the process. But as you say, there was shaming going on. The names were published in the local newspaper, so people knew who was getting exempt and who wasn't. That was it was a terrible thing to go through. But I'm sure the pressure also built up. It did on my grandfather. I'm sure working a streetcar every day, getting on, by 1917, people getting on the streetcar, seeing this young lad, why aren't you serving overseas? So he wrote home in a letter when he got over there and said, I'm glad that's all behind me after, we discussed that so much. Yeah, and I'm glad I'm finally getting a chance to serve, and I'm going to do the best I can.
I mean, it's really interesting to read that part in your book, right? Because you have that family letters, and it's just so interesting. And then we'll move forward. We'll talk about the battle in a second. But this is a really interesting question that I don't know. It's from Eric Edwards asking, as you said, that the British did it first. Did the Canadian state or military take any lessons from the way the Brits had done it?
Well, they certainly would have taken some lessons learned, although what specific they are, I'm not really sure what, because the Brits started conscripting about, as I said, late January, early February 1916, and the first Canadians were not actually. There were Canadians conscripted in October, even though the first call didn't come until the 3rd of January. Anybody who was on the list could not volunteer. Those that were recruited from the 13th of October to the 3rd of January 1918 were considered voluntarily conscripted, because they showed up and said, "This is coming anyways. Let's just get going." The Brits by that time, had been conscripting for 2 years, and in the end, of the 5 million British soldiers who served, over 50% were conscripted. So the stigma of being conscripted never developed sufficiently in the UK as it did, at least the evidence. I mean, I've read Alana Batel's book on conscripts, and I refer to it in my book. Although she doesn't talk about what the conscripts did in battle, she talks about the social dimensions of the whole thing, and how the myths about participation survived. So the lessons that Canada did not want to take from their conscription were the bad ones. Obviously, where there was discrimination against these, mostly so after the war, just like it was in Canada after the war. I mean, Canadian soldiers or conscripts were discriminated against. I point this out in the book, certainly before they joined and when they showed up, for example, my grandfather in London, Ontario. But the discrimination and the vitriol that, was in their direction diminished the closer they got to the front. When they got to England for their training, it was still there. But by the time, after being in battle one day, they were all brothers in arms. And certainly that's the way the soldiers in the trenches viewed these guys. I mean, there's countless stories where they had bad feelings about them until they showed up and found out that they were well trained and they might save their own lives. So I don't know if I've answered Eric's question, but the British, the lessons learned I mean, it was a different thing because the order of magnitude was quite different. Canada was trying to get 100,000 conscripts,
Right.
and it eventually got 2.5 million. So the numbers are quite substantially different. I mean, eventually, by the end of the war, they were quite a conscript army, as was the U.S. Army.
Yes.
It was 75% conscripts. And so when, for example, a train left Detroit, to send conscripts off to their training camp, there was a big parade for them. I mean, to send the draftees.
Yeah.
When my grandfather's train left Windsor, Ontario, it left in the darkness of night and unheralded without anybody. Not only that, after they'd finished the time in London, they also put them on a train secretly to send them,
in the middle of the night.
to the East Coast, to board the ships.
Yep.
Or to Quebec. So it was almost as if they were trying to avoid drawing any special attention to this, whereas the volunteers got sent off with great fanfare. But the American draftees were sent off with great fanfare. So Canada was the only one. So that's a difference, I think, between us and the Americans, and probably between us and the Brits as well, because it became so big. Being a draftee, when you're in the majority of people in uniform, certainly was not that big a deal.
Well, even in this bit off topic, but that even goes into the Second World War, right? You hear in the United States and the British context, right? It's the same. You hear, Grandpa signed up. Okay, did he though? Like a lot of them were drafted, didn't like to talk about it. So it's a part of this. So there's a good question here that I would just want to get to, and then we'll get into kind of the experience of the conscripts in a second. I think Eric's right. It's all any resident who lived in Canada at the time so that's the Military Service Act, the MSA, was subject to conscription.
Yeah, that's a good point, Eric. Where you were living on the 4th of August, 1914, when the war started for the British Empire, determined whether or not you could be conscripted.
Yep.
Now that's why countless Americans who were farming out west, for example, eventually ended up getting conscripted because that they were living and farming out there. And certainly when conscription came along in 1917, there was although the Canadian government said they weren't conscripting American citizens, they were conscripting all kinds of Americans. I mean, I think there was about 35,000 Americans who actually joined voluntarily with the Canadian Army, which is a substantial number. Mm-hmm. But when conscription went into place, the fact of if you were born in the United States, my own grandfather, for example, was born in Bristol, Rhode Island, and yet, of course, there was no consideration for his place of birth when he was conscripted because he was living in Windsor, Ontario. Interestingly enough, in the house that he lived in, the house of his uncle in downtown Windsor, and his first cousin, his uncle's oldest son, was working in Detroit at the same time. And if you were working in Detroit and had a domicile address in Detroit, being a Canadian, you could join the military through the British Canadian recruiting mission.
Right.
And so his cousin, in fact, he come back across the border, would have been conscripted, but he joined the British Canadian recruiting mission, which made him a volunteer. Mm-hmm. And so any stigma that goes with your method of recruitment didn't affect him. And that happened in countless cases of people who joined up through the British Canadian recruiting mission. And those soldiers, this obviously was done, through late 1917, early 1918 until July 1918, when when the UK and the United States said that we would conscript anybody that hadn't joined by that time and was living in their country could be conscripted. So an American who had not joined the American Armed Forces and was living in London, England, could be conscripted by the British Army. Likewise, Canada agreed to that, and so Americans living in Canada at that point, after the end of July 1918, could have been conscripted. So your place of birth had a lot to do with it, but it was based on where you lived on the 4th of August, 1914.
Yeah, and I mean, there's cases too that I know now about, because the access to records. There's Japanese citizens who are conscripted, right? They face all kinds of legal and social discrimination in Canada, but you're a military age male, so you're good to go, So it's a whole another level to this already complicated topic that to me is so interesting, right?
I write about one Japanese soldier in the book who was born in Hiroshima, migrated to Hawaii, and then was working in Vancouver. He won a military medal. So Japanese.
There was another one I know. I don't think he was born in British India, but I think he was of Indian background, and he was a defaulter because I found him through just searching. So anyway, it all applies, right? If you're fit, you fit. So with that said, we had a good question. So, and I think this is a good launch into kind of, okay, say you're a conscript now. You don't get an exemption. You've got a report. So we had a question about, are conscripts sent to specific units, or are they strictly based on the needs of the CEF? And we can maybe use that as a springboard to kind of explain what happens next.
Yeah, well, wherever you were conscripted at, there was a regiment associated. Whether it's Vancouver or Toronto, you could. I guess there was some latitude. You didn't. That was the other reason for joining before the Royal Proclamation calling out the first class of conscripts on October the 13th. If you joined before that, even though the legislation had been given royal assent on the 29th of August, over the next 6 weeks, a lot of people, these voluntary conscripts, could join and pick something other than infantry, whether it was artillery or service corps, something that might give them a better chance of surviving, and a lot of them did. Or, of course, for Americans or Canadians living in the United States, they could have joined up through the British Canadian Recruiting Mission, knowing that it was coming. But I think you ended up, in case my grandfather, he went to the 18th Battalion, but the Western Ontario Regiment was providing soldiers out of London for the 1st Battalion, the 18th Battalion, and the 47th Battalion. Likewise in Vancouver, the 1st Battalion, the 72nd Battalion. There were other regiments that were serviced by the British Columbia Regiment, where you would end up. Now, when you went to the training camp, for example, the Western Ontario Regiment was in the 4th Reserve Training Brigade. So initially, you would have been assigned or expected to go, as in case of my grandfather, he wanted to go where his buddies were going, to the 18th Battalion. Other guys wanted to go to the, were routed off to the 47th Battalion, and that's where they went. But that didn't mean that was a final deal. A lot of them ended up going to the next step was you crossed, when you finally got called to go overseas, you were dispatched to France. You went to the center there, the brigade center for indoctrinating the new arrivals before the conscripts were sent to the Canadian Corps Reinforcement Camp. Again, they might have been, you might still have been with the 18th Battalion, but some of these guys ended up going, say, to the 31st Battalion because they had more casualties in the most recent battle.
Yeah.
This happened pretty dynamically once the 100 Days campaign started. So a lot of soldiers who thought they were going to a specific battalion, and they had been told, they were told not only in England, but they were told at the Canadian Corps Reinforcement Camp, once they were sent to the front lines to join the battalion in the field, some of the battalions they would trade. They'd send, the 18th Battalion would send guys over to the 47th Battalion. So you didn't know until you actually arrived there which battalion you were gonna end up with.
Yeah.
At that point, the casualties were climbing so rapidly that battalions were being replenished as the battles took place. I point this out in the book. I mean, that was the first time in the war where they were replacing soldiers in that way. In other words, they'd arrive at the battalion, they'd have almost no time whatsoever to become acclimatized, to meet their section leader, to do the types of things, to introduce them to the do's and don'ts. I mean, they were thrust into combat fairly rapidly. Yeah. And so there was a lot of criticism after the war, misplaced as it turned out, about the conscripts not being fully trained which we can talk about later on. But it turns out most of them did have sufficient training to do their duty.
Right, and I profiled a conscript really quickly on Twitter. I think I did it on Sunday and then retweeted it today. He followed exactly the path as you described. So he was he was from outside the London, Ontario area. He was sent to London. Same with my great grandfather. They're all connected through this one little camp because it served the area from Windsor, basically almost to Toronto. They all went there to. Which is still there today. Wolseley Barracks is still a base, the Canadian Forces today.
It was my first base.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a great story. So many people I talk to have been through there. It's so ubiquitous almost. But anyway, so this soldier, Joseph Fryer, he did exactly as you described. Conscripted, didn't get an exemption. He tried, he didn't get it. He went through the process, ended up with the 1st Battalion. And he was only with the unit, I think, 2 weeks before he was killed today, anniversary today. He was killed on the first day of Canal du Nord with the 1st Battalion. So he literally followed that set structure. And there was a few other with him as well who were also killed that day. I was able to kind of understand that maybe it was an artillery blast that hit them all. But anyway, that was just as far as I got. But yeah, it's really interesting, like you mentioned too. It was a set structure, but doesn't mean it was always followed. Like you said, the 100 days, which is such a central part of conscription and conscripts experience in the First World War. And I want to ask about that in a second, but it creates such a need for this not ad hoc, because that's not the right word, but sometimes, like you said, they have to slot people in where they're needed because the casualties are increasing as the 100 days goes on, right? It's the most high number of casualties of Canada's war, right? So it's really interesting to think about it in that way, that this central role that conscription plays in the 100 days. But that's also said because I think you talked about at the beginning about the myths, right? That conscription is not just, say, starts with Canal du Nord, as some people have said, right? You take it further back. They enter the lines before the 100 days, correct?
Yeah. Well, this is coming back to the distinguished speaker who, set me off on this journey. As far as conscripts arriving too late, the first conscript arrived in the field in late April 1918. The first conscript was wounded in action a week later. The first conscript killed in action was on the 10th of June, 1918. The first conscript to win a military medal was on the 9th of August, the second day of the battle at Amiens, or the second day of the 100 days campaign. You also mentioned the casualties. It's worth mentioning that in those 96 days, that nearly 46,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and prisoner, but that doesn't include all the sick wastage, which was over 10,000, occurred in those 96 days. Over 20% of all the casualties that occurred in the Canadian Corps in the entire war. So it was a period of time of great, intense, one battle, it seemed, after the next. And of course, as Currie himself pointed out, he was losing 100 soldiers a day just to sick wastage and other things that had nothing to do with an offensive that they might have been on at the time.
Yeah, can you just explain real quick what it's such a, I don't know, the kind of a derogatory term. What does wastage actually mean? Like, I know what it means, but if you could just quickly explain what that means.
Well, it was a term that was used everywhere, in the First World War. Wastage is we would consider it a very derogatory way of referring to casualties, and wastage could be, killed, wounded, or prisoners, or sick, wounded, people suffering from battle exhaustion, which was not very well treated at the time, especially if you were enlisted.
Yes.
So that came under the broad rubric of wastage, and so they did statistical analysis to determine, how much wastage was occurring by the day, so they could determine how many reinforcements they needed. It was something that Currie was briefed on every single day.
Yeah, I mean, there's another comment. It's a good way of saying it. It's terrible, but it's true. This is soldiers' inventory. I mean, wastage is what it sounds like. It's towards no seemingly goal or towards an end, right? It's not. Yeah. If you're killed in an offensive, it's not wastage.
Yeah, soldiers' inventory. is one
Sorry?
is a good way. I agree. Soldiers is inventory.
It's terrible, but it's
it's a terrible way
accurate.
of describing it. But
yeah, I might steal that. Thanks, Eric. But it's true. I mean, it's terrible, but it's true. So so like you just mentioned, that's a myth that conscripts don't enter the line. That's not true. So I wondered if you could start with today, because today, as we mentioned at the top of the show, for those of you who missed it, is the anniversary, 103rd anniversary. 103rd, yes. Good math. Of the start of the Canal du Nord battle, right? I profiled it on Twitter. It's a battle that's well known. I think it should be better known. I said again, I think it's Curry's masterpiece. I know you have some opinions on what that means, but I wonder if you could just kind of talk about that battle and then how kind of the conscript element fits into that.
Yeah, I would say day one of Canal du Nord is General Curry's masterpiece. After day one, I think we have to have a discussion about it. But certainly, day one was a master stroke. As I mentioned already, one of my cousins was killed that day. His younger brother, by the way, also a conscript, had been killed on the 2nd of September, just 3.5 weeks earlier on the DQ line.
Yeah.
So the casualties made up. Curry thrust through on a dry part of the canal in a very surprise move. 6 battalions. I liken this to the 6 battalions that established a beachhead in Normandy on the 6th of June, because that was the sharp edge of the divisions, the 3 divisions that Curry intended on pushing across, and he was successful. Yes. But it was a very fierce, intense battle. So it was a narrow 2-kilometer front that he had. There was quite a bit of concern that he was making a very serious error in judgment. As it turns out, the surprise and all the other elements, and the fact that the soldiers performed magnificently. They did get a lodgement there on the first day, and some pressed forward quite significantly to the northwest, although those that went up against Bourlon Wood immediately to the east ran into pretty stiff opposition, and they weren't surprised about that. So it took them a couple of days. But at the end of the second day, Curry's forces were not only exhausted, in my view, but had been reduced quite significantly in all of the attacking battalions. Some of them were already down to half strength. Mm-hmm. The other thing that Curry did not do is he did not pause. One of the questions that was asked to me about Curry was, Pat, what would you have done differently? Mm-hmm. Surely you don't think you could have done differently. And I said, well, what I would have done differently was I would have implemented Curry's plan as he wrote it. And one of the key aspects of his plan was to pause for a day.
Right.
But he fought 5 successive days in a row. He had made this mistake once on the 28th of August by not pausing a day and leaving the 3rd and 4th Division in the line. The 2nd and 3rd Division in the line. Yeah. 2nd Division did not fight again for 5 weeks after that 28th of August fiasco. The same rules, I think, applied on the 28th. After 2 days of exhaustion, Curry only devotes 75 words in his diary to the events of the 28th of September, but he pushed forward on the 29th, and all of the battalions were pushed back for the same reasons the other guys weren't able to get forward on the 28th. And then, remarkably enough, and this was from the battalion commanders and brigade commanders expressing extreme astonishment that he pushed for a 4th day in a row, and shockingly, for a 5th day in a row. The 5th day, the 1st of October, another cousin of mine, first cousin, was killed in action serving with the 1st Battalion. So I had 2 cousins killed in Canal du Nord, what they call the Broad Canal du Nord, but it was a 5-day battle that did not stop. And it's true, I say, my criticism of Curry, I think, is balanced. I say many wonderful things about him in my book, and where it needs balance, I provide that. I think I'm not the first to do that. Canal du Nord was one example of where other historians have said that Curry pushed too hard. Shane Schreiber, Tim Travers, Tim Cook, J.P. Harris in the UK. I mean, there are a lot of historians that have said that Curry was pushing too hard. And I suspect that one of the reasons why Curry could push so hard is because he had an unlimited supply of reinforcements coming up the line. There was only one commander in the field that could do what Curry was doing. That was Pershing, because the Americans had so many reinforcements coming forward. So I think in this case, had Curry paused for a day, I mean, one of the problems was that the units were not being as well served by artillery as they moved forward, because the deal was to bring the artillery up.
Yeah.
And Curry believed in it, and it had some very great successes with artillery. But when they weren't available, he still continued the offensive, and that cost him. The other thing Curry's known for preserving troops, at the most limited cost possible. Yep. But that didn't happen at Canal du Nord.
No, it didn't.
And one of the principles that he violated at Canal du Nord was he did not believe in sending half-strength battalions up against formidable obstacles, and yet he did it 3 days in a row at Canal du Nord, which proved very costly.
Yeah, and it did it. And I think you're right too, mentioning that source of manpower is important, because in your book, it's mentioned in other places. I think it was mentioned this afternoon in the Western Front Association talk with Bill Stewart and Tim Cook about this ability of the Canadian Corps to keep them going. Yeah. Tim Cook mentioned that, right? That he could keep going, right? These numbers of casualties, like we already mentioned, 100 days, the major set piece parts are huge. Like, they're massive, and yet the Canadian Corps can keep going at pretty much full strength till the end of the war. No other, and you mentioned this explicitly in your book, and I think it's a good way of looking at it. You talk about the Australians who didn't have conscription. They didn't have it at all for overseas, and they run out of steam. They run literally out of troops by the end of the war. They can't keep fighting, and the Canadians can. Again, other than the Americans who have millions coming, but the Canadians are able to keep going. Whether you agree or not, if that's a good thing about keeping Canadians in line, it's a whole other thing. But for the military effectiveness, it's striking. And yes, Curry does make mistakes. I agree. He's human. He pushed too hard. Wasn't the first time, as you mentioned, he pushed too hard. I mean, I even think he did it way before that. I think Hill 70, he pushed inappropriately and got a lot of people killed when he shouldn't.
Yeah, certainly the last part of it. He pushed too hard. He pushed too hard
in certain cases. I mean, that happens. And I agree with Eric here about not wanting to consolidate. And Eric's right. That is part of the thinking. And I've looked at that myself. Curry's thinking about that. But again, there's a balance to that. And
there is a balance. But
I don't think he struck it every time.
When he developed his original plan, he took that into account. That you know that as you're bringing your own artillery forward, the enemy is reinforcing.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it gives your troops a pause. It allows you to replenish your troops instead of sending in a half-strength battalion unsupported by artillery against formidable defenses. You now have a chance of sending in a much more robust battalion that's had a day to refresh with support of artillery against obviously a strong defense. But I mean, the other thing was Curry was pushing forward faster than the two British corps on his right and left flanks.
Yes, he was.
And they were taking far less casualties. I mean, in the 100 days, I think the Canadian Corps suffers about 60% of all the casualties of the First British Army.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Or not first. The Army casualties from that period, the Canadian Corps was 60% of.
The First Army, yeah.
Yeah, it's not insignificant.
No, and they weren't 60% of the strength. So
No, they weren't 60% of the strength.
That's a huge element of that. And I think that's part of this consideration. And this kind of brings it back to what we were talking about before, but the whole politics element of this. And I think someone asked, was it worth it in that sense? Like, I think somebody asked, was that, the national fissures and all the divisions and everything, was it worth it? And at the sharp end, pure military terms, I think you have to say yes.
Yes. I mean, the even A.M. Wilms in 1956 in an article described conscription as militarily necessary. If you look at it the objective was to keep 4 Canadian divisions in the field.
Yeah.
And obviously, from a political perspective, it was not a good decision to go with conscription. It polarized the country. I think the country was polarized before conscription, but it certainly was more so and has been ever since.
Yeah.
But from a military perspective alone, Curry was able to keep his 4 divisions, as you say, keep them generally up to strength and continue the offensive. So as a consequence, Canada as a nation was quite victorious in that 96-day campaign. Yeah. Without conscripts, there would not have been a 96-day. There would not have been 100 days for the Canadian Corps. They'd have been done probably after day 2 of Arras. They might have been able to field 2 divisions after that, but they would have been like the Australians. They would have had, to fight with, augmented by the Brits or which the Canadians were, or as the Americans were augmenting the Australians.
Yeah.
It would have been over in September for the Canadian Corps in terms of the great victories that they eventually had.
Right, and that made me think of kind of moving, because we're getting close to the hour, and I'd like to talk about a few more things, and then we can wrap up. But the thing that always sticks out to me with conscripts and the war and how it ends, I don't want to talk about Mons and Curry, whether it wasn't his decision to keep pushing. He was ordered to keep pushing. But the thing about Mons is the last Canadian killed and the last British Empire soldier, same person, was a conscript.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think, to me, that speaks so many volumes, again, because I like using individuals to understand broader terms. And because I looked at George Price's service file today. He was one of those ones who went forward in 1917, because his is October, I think 16th is it signed, because I checked it this afternoon, which I've totally forgot about. I think I've looked at it before, but I didn't realize he was one of those ones, one of the first ones. Yeah. He said, yeah, okay, I guess I'm just making this up, but based on the dates, he's saying, yeah, I'm going to get conscripted. Let's just get it over with.
Yeah, I met Price's nephew and namesake, George Barkhouse, lives in Canning, Nova Scotia. I last saw him at the 100th anniversary ceremonies in Mons 3 years ago. And Price had been wounded once earlier, before he came back to the unit, and then, of course, was killed on the 11th of November. So, conscripts were certainly dying more frequently, because they were becoming more and more a greater percentage of the units. Right. I say 25%, on average, but there were some that, 50% of the battalions. But coming back to Canal du Nord, there were about 10 battalions at the end of Canal du Nord that never fought in any actions after Canal du Nord. That's how badly exhausted they were.
They were forced out of the line of battle, which is, again, huge, right? And that connects through too, because they keep pushing to Cambrai, and then, as we know, they keep pushing all the way till they get to Mons, till the armistice. But again, these are some complicated questions and some complicated trends. And again, I got to inevitably ask, we already asked the military aspect of this, and I think you've already hinted at it, but studying this the way you have, writing on it, looking at the personal parts of all of this, the legacy of conscription, there's so much here. I mean, I still argue we don't fully understand in this country what it's done to this country. It's still dividing people today, whether they realize it or not. I got to ask, do you think it was worth it, everything considered?
Well, again, from a military perspective, if I was Curry, I would say yes. The Canadians made a major contribution on the Western Front in the last 96 days. Was it worth it politically? That's a totally different question. I mean, the same battle was being fought in 1942 by the government of Mackenzie King, and that's when they decided to keep conscripts in Canada until the very end of the war, and they referred to them as zombies. Matter of fact, I had people have referred to conscripts of the First World War as zombies, and I said, no, you can't call them zombies. That term didn't exist in the First World War, and besides, it's a totally different thing. I mean, there were, I think, 69 conscripts killed in action in 1945, and that there were 7,500 conscripts either killed or wounded in the last 96 days of the last 100 days. So it's a totally different subject, but they are linked together. The politics are linked from the First to the Second World War.
Oh yeah, it's completely unavoidable.
Yeah,
because I mean, King makes it completely unavoidable.
But it's important. I mean, to know. One of the things I speculated on is that the more we know about conscription, at least they didn't know. At the end of the First World War, there were elections fought. As a matter of fact, I point out in my book that lack of information on conscripts impacted, I think, the elections in 1921, 1925, and 1926. They really didn't know what contribution conscripts had made.
Right.
It was assumed that they didn't make any contribution, and as a matter of fact, that myth was perpetuated by Curry himself.
Yes.
So that laid around for a long time until the 1960s, when people started addressing this in greater detail. And again, they didn't know. I asked Terry Kopp. I said, why hasn't this subject been written on before? Other than the politics of conscription, which Jack Grandestein had written on. And he said, you don't know? I said, no, Terry, I don't know. He said, it's too hard. It's too tough. And certainly it was much more difficult to do pre-internet. But now people put so much information online, letters and, diaries and things, there's a wealth of information that challenges all those myths.
Yeah. And I mean, it's part of, I think I say this all the time, but I like challenging myths. I like breaking them down. This is one of them. The whole conscript thing. And I did want to ask this, one of probably the last one or two questions I did want to ask, because I think it's important. I do think Curry made a lot of right decisions. I don't want to keep piling on him, but I do have to ask. And if you could explain a little bit what Curry says after the war, or what he says even in the, right as after the armistice, right? Because I think he blames conscripts for the riots, right, that take place, which is unfair.
Yeah. Well, there were riots. I think, as it turned out, in France. I mean, the soldiers wanted to get back. 7th Brigade was the focus of attention, and Curry immediately assumed that the people in the brigade that were causing the disturbance were conscripts, and
yes.
he even wrote the minister in England that was his belief. Yeah, and he carried on that belief for quite a long time. And when he was confronted with evidence to the contrary, he didn't apologize for it. He simply thought he thought they were disloyal. Conscripts were as loyal. They performed in battle as well as any volunteers. There were good conscripts, bad conscripts, but generally speaking, they were just like the volunteers. Yeah. So, but when it came to this, there was no evidence whatsoever that conscripts were involved in what some people considered a mutiny of the 7th Brigade, or later on in the riots in Real, in England, when they were in the concentration camps, because that's what they were called, getting ready to go back to Canada, and there was a big riot there and a few people killed. There's no evidence that I found or anybody else has come up that conscripts had anything to do with that. If anything, if I was a conscript, I would certainly keep a low profile, because
I'd run away.
I wouldn't want to be involved in this, because right away
you'd be the first one picked.
Yeah, so
you're caught. You're the one blamed. You're the conscript.
You're the usual suspects. Well, in this case, they didn't find any conscripts.
No, none of them were charged. There was people charged. There were soldiers charged.
Yeah, there were no conscripts.
All volunteers, and there was murders. Like, they killed a police officer. No conscripts involved. Well, not that were charged, right? That can be proven. Yeah. So it's a really good point to think about it that way. I mean, there's been some discussion in the comments about whether there's military pressure. Curry's in favor of it. Does he say outright? No, he doesn't say it outright. I think he makes one letter at one point saying we need conscription, but that's it. He doesn't do it again. So it's a very, again, interesting and nuanced part of this is who's pushing.
He wanted conscription.
He did,
because he needed the soldiers, but he obviously thought that obviously volunteers were a cut above.
He did.
The regular volunteer soldier. But still he was not an unbiased viewer when it came to that. The other thing I think he might have had some influence on, and I'm not sure, was the awards of decorations, military medals. There were over 6,200 military medals awarded from August 1918 to July 1919, and conscripts got less than 1%, which is outrageous given those. And when you look at the citations of those that did win, I mean, the 85th Battalion, for one, the official historian Hayes wrote in his book on one battle there about 17 men that distinguished themselves way above and beyond the call. 15 of them got the military medal and 2 didn't. The 2 that didn't were conscripts. Right. So, and that was one of the, I think, one of the 10 battalions that did not award any military medals at all. So sadly, there were some that didn't. And I'm not sure what influence Curry placed on his division commanders or whether or not he had a signing decided that, that no, those soldiers that were recommended for the military medal. But given the numbers of conscripts, the number of actions that they were in the 96 days of the 100-day campaign, one would think that those numbers should have been significantly higher, and they weren't.
Right, and I think that's a good point because conscripts don't obviously make up that percentage, but in the front line sharp end units they're making up a higher percentage, as we've already talked about. So I think it's an interesting way of going about that, and then you've structured your book around that because again, it's an available record. The citations are available to find, so you use that. I'm just guessing, but I assume that's part of why. But it does show that the conscripts are doing more. They're not, the shirkers, the malingerers that they've been called for years. Like there's so many pictures of, volunteers, saying conscript, it's your turn. The shirkers are coming, that kind of thing. And the election, again, I don't want to talk about that more, but it's the soldier vote and all of that is part of it. I mean,
slackers, shirkers, malingerers, and cowards.
Yeah, it's all documented. There's so many photos. It was not hidden from. All kinds of people wrote about it at the time. And again, I think this is a good point to end on because we already we touched on this, but then moving conscription into the Second World War and the legacies, I think that's a good way to look at a legacy of this.
Dan Byers, by the way, Dan Byers' book, Zombie Army, obviously does make the connection between the First World War. So I'd invite listeners who are interested in that connection to seek out Dan Byers' book, Zombie Army, because it's quite good in that respect.
Yeah, and I'll put a link after this. I'll put that in there because I agree. It's a great book. It's Second World War focused, but obviously the First World War has an impact. So, but sorry, I did want to come back because, and Dan Byers' work connects to this, the idea of the zombie, right? They're just follow. They don't think, they don't act, right? It's not an appropriate term even in the Second World War because conscription in the Second World War is even more nuanced in certain ways. But anyway, I think that's a good point to think about these conscripts who we both have a personal connection to. We're admitting our bias, but these men some of them had their reasons to avoid service. But once they were called upon, they did, and they did their job. And I think that's important. I think that's an important thing to remember. You can debate all day long about the politic part of it, the military necessity. I think Sheldrake 6 mentioned, why is the Canadian divisions always at the sharp end? Why are they always the point of the attack? I don't want to get into that because that's not what we're doing here today. Maybe we can talk about that another time. But I think it's an interesting way of looking at it. The conscription allows all of this. And it's just, unfortunately, it's not as well known as it could be. Yes, there's other parts that are known, like the shootings in Quebec City. That's well known, and the politics. But again, your book, and again, I'm just going to sing your praises because you had you on the show for a reason because you know what you're talking about. It brings it into a new light, and I think that's necessary. I think Eric said the same thing. It changed his perception of the conscripts and what that means for the war. So I do want to say thank you for coming on. Thank you for writing this book, and thank you for changing my perspectives as well as conscripts and giving me a new insight into what that means.
Good. I'm glad you you enjoyed the book, and I hope your listeners enjoy it as much as you. Thank you for having me on your program, Brad, and good luck with your future programs.
All right, thanks a lot, Pat. I'm just gonna talk to the audience real quick, and I'll come back and say goodbye, and we'll end it for today. So thanks everyone for watching. I really enjoyed this one. I hope you did as well. This is a really, really interesting topic. Do check out the book. Get it any way you can. If you can help me with one of the links in the description, that would be really appreciated. Again, if you like my work and the guests and all of the stuff I'm doing on social media and doing with all the videos and other things, please support me on Patreon if you can. You do get some benefits for doing so, but also you help me keep doing my work, and buy me a coffee as well. If you can, that's greatly appreciated. And thanks again for that. And also please subscribe to the channel. I need as many subscribers as I can get, trying to reach 1,000. Please help there, like the video and comment after this. It helps people see the video afterwards. And that's my goal, is getting many people as possible to see this stuff. So I got some more stuff coming out next week. Still trying to get everything organized. So keep an eye on social media, and also schedule everything on here so you can keep track of all of that. But there's a lot coming up. It's a really exciting time for the channel, and I'm really, really excited for what's coming. So thanks again, Pat. Just really appreciate you coming on again. And if you got anything else coming up in the future, I'd love to have you back on.
Yeah, I would finish with one last thing, Brad.
Go for it.
It's a poem written by Siegfried Sassoon.
Okay, there we go.
Called Conscripts. Siegfried Sassoon, most people know his story. He was quite contemptuous of conscripts, but this is what he wrote in his poem Conscripts. He said, "But the kind, common ones that I despised, hardly a man of them I count as a friend. What stubborn-hearted virtues they disguised. They stood and played the hero to the end, won gold and silver medals bright with bars, and marched resplendent home with crowns and stars." There you go.
That's a perfect ending. Thanks for finishing on that note. I can't come up with anything better. So again, thanks everyone for coming, and have a good night, everybody.